So if we look at this area in West Africa you focused on, what did it look like in terms of rulers and subject peoples before the Atlantic slave trade arrived?
Well, so one of the things which I argue in the book is that and I think which is different in relation to previous approaches to the subject is the continuity and the importance of the pre-existing setup for understanding how the Atlantic slave trade developed and how the cultural framework developed in Africa in response to that. So in this part of Africa you had a long-standing connection with the trans-Saharan trade. There were interlocking diasporas. You had North African diasporas trading from the Maghreb across the Sahara to the Sahel. And then you had African diasporas connecting the forests, for example, of Guinea-Bissau, what is now Guinea-Conakry, Liberia and Sierra Leone, to those trades and trading products such as cola nuts, wax, ivory, to the termini of the caravan trade and then on into North Africa. So one of the things to free ourselves from, I think, is this idea that this was an area which was, in inverted commas, untouched prior to the Atlantic slave trade. It wasn't. It was actually connected to North Africa and connected to Turkey. For example, Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali in the 14th century, was supposed to have had personal servants from what is now Turkey. So there were global connections from this part of Africa, and that affected the type of society. You had the empires of Mali, of Ghana, empires of the Mandinka people, which were fundamentally based on long-distance trade, connections across the Sahara, and the wealth that brought with them. And then but then in the coastal areas, which is where my book is really concentrated, and you had a very different geography. You had a geography. So in the interior, you have a quite dry, relatively flat terrain, savanna land, which is quite easy for armies and mounted armies on horseback and also soldiers to operate in. But then on the coast, you do have swampy areas, mangrove swamps, forests, which are much harder for those armies to control. And the peoples who lived in that area formed a decentralized community, different, very small political units, often coexisting within the space of 20 or 30 miles.
Yeah.
So you had to...
Very different from the extended Malian...
So you had actually quite different political structures coexisting within the same geographical area.
And this Trans-Sahara trade, what role did it play in what followed?
Well, what is very interesting about this is the role of diasporas. So the Mandinka diasporas, which I mentioned, who connected the trade, the produce of the forest regions, for example, the cola nuts, the wax, to the caravan termini. They were dispersed communities, and they influenced the trading practices in those forest regions. And there were Mandinka traders who settled in different regions. And what I think is very interesting is that, for me, this shows that the peoples of that area had a long history of interacting with long-distance traders, and they had a long history of cultural accommodation. You know, the Mandinka represented a powerful political force. Mali was the most powerful force in the region, so they brought with them the trappings of that empire. They brought with them literacy, for example. They brought, Arabic. They brought with them products from North Africa. And so there was a history of cultural accommodation, because although the Mandinka brought that, at the same time, when they intermarried with peoples in those regions, they often adopted the social pattern. So, for example, the Mandinka in that region adopted matrilineal forms of inheritance, whereas traditionally Mandinka are patrilineal. So there was this kind of cultural accommodation, which I call creolisation, or is generally called creolisation, but then in the book I call a sort of primary creolisation. And then the argument is that when the transatlantic traders came, because these peoples had that long pre-existing history, they were much more willing to welcome and accept traders from a new long-distance empire, trading instead of across the Sahara by sea. But structurally, the trade is actually not very different. The trade is that there was some trade in slaves across the Sahara, so you have a trade in slaves across the Atlantic, and also often identified by religious unity as the trans-Saharan trade was. So the Mandinka were Muslim, and many of the long-distance Atlantic traders were new Christians. They were descended from converted Jews. So again, you have
out of Portugal and Spain.
Out of Portugal and Spain. So you have a structural similarity there,
Yeah.
and that is where the mixed communities of the Creole communities, which facilitated the transatlantic trade, were rooted. They were rooted in the same communities which had seen trans-Saharan traders also welcomed. So I think that's the link there.
And what's the aspect of creolisation, primary creolisation, as you call it in the book, that facilitates this trade? What are the factors within that? Part of it's language, isn't it?
Part of it's language, and so for example, there's an example from the 16th century of somebody who was known as a lançado. Lançados were Cape Verdeans, and Portuguese lançar is to throw, so they were thrown out, or they threw themselves in, if you like, to African societies. They lived there, they intermarried, they had children. And there was a famous lançado who was known as Ganagoga. Now Ganagoga in the Biafada language means somebody who speaks all the languages. So clearly creolisation is a sort of receptivity to different languages and to different cultural forms. And this part of Africa is famously multilingual. I mean, even if you go there today, you'll find people often, I mean, I know people who speak 6 languages fluent, often unrelated languages. So there is a sense in which that kind of cultural receptivity and accommodation is created. And clearly, if you're going to have trading communities of mixed African-European groups living, you need some kind of cultural receptivity to enable that to happen. So the argument
some of these people went through 2 transitions, because the Jews became new Christians, became
absolutely
something
that's
else.
Right, and that's one of the interesting things, that you have these stories. For example, there's a story I talk about in the book of a whole network of new Christians who, in the 1540s, 2 of their 2 uncles were arrested and tried by the Inquisition in Portugal and were in prison for 3 or 4 years. And an 8-year-old boy is rescued by his uncle and taken to Cape Verde, because the uncle is the Portuguese royal factor in Cape Verde. And then a brother of that uncle becomes the factor in what is now Guinea-Bissau. And then you have this whole network which builds up of people who had to adapt by adopting Christianity and then fleeing from persecution, but then adapting to society in West Africa. So yes, as you say, that's a sort of
double.
But one of the things I think which is interesting is that the history in Portugal and in Spain of having to adapt, I think, maybe opened the way for new Christians to be more adaptable when they got to West Africa. Because one of the things which emerges is that they were the community which was among the Portuguese who were in Cape Verde, they were the community who seemed to have found it easier to move to West Africa and form mixed communities, and maybe that history in Portugal helped them do that.
The mixing of races and the creation of Creole society seems paradoxically to have sparked the first stirrings of racism against Africans. Why was this the case?
I mean, yes, I think there is truth in that. It is in a sense paradoxical, because creolisation often these days brings with it positive connotations. It's mixing, it's accepting what is new and forming something stronger as a result of it. But of course we need to be aware that that's actually quite a modern interpretation. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, mixtures were seen as degenerate, hybrids, and that wasn't a positive sense. So that brings with it its own sort of contemporary aspect. But it does seem to be in contrast to racism, which of course is a very essentialist worldview. Fundamentally, I think I think it's a mistake to think that you have a holistic ideology emerging in the 16th century. What you have is a lot of things happening at the same time. Some of which point in one way, and some of which point in another. So you have these communities living among Africans, intermarrying them and having African children whose
taking on African customs,
taking on African identities, whose children inherit because of their maternal lineage, because they live in matrilineal societies and they inherit through the mother's line. And clearly, the theory of racist essentialism doesn't stand up, as we all know, in practice when you live among people and see them in daily life. So you have